Corregge-mi regal.
Ja sti faig cu mai.
Oh, tu compagn mil grat.
Nu mai ne cu tunel.
Guarda svessa.
Mundaun is a first-person folk horror game set in the Swedish town of Mundaun. It follows Kurden, who returns to his childhood home after hearing of his grandfather's death. Atmosphere. The world of Mundaun is surreal and strange, blending the unfamiliar with the supernatural effortlessly. It creates scenes of extreme peace, but also manages to make the same areas daunting, with the soundtrack resembling something out of The Shining, to fill the environment with an ominous feeling of dread and uncertainty. The black and white hand-drawn style really makes things more dramatic, but it also makes them creepy as well, like you're in some alternate world or somehow wandered into a painting. The culture difference as well makes a lot of things seem unfamiliar. What's perfectly normal to the rural folk of Sweden comes across as strange to me, from the way they live their life to their superstitions, which makes for so many interesting points during the game. You often feel like you've been uprooted from the real world, or you're witnessing something you shouldn't. Little things like sleeping with a spiked board on their chest to ward off evil spirits, or the way the lantern has a spiral cut in it. It just makes the place seem quirky, but almost alien. On top of this, they throw in the clearly supernatural as well, with bizarre enemies with unnatural powers, almost biblical events like it raining black hail or the antagonist's face appearing in a lake. These things fill the world with a hopeless sense of impending doom. The game takes place over several days, and you have to sleep in Kurden's grandfather's house whilst the enemies roam freely outside. It's distressingly unsafe to be doing so, and makes you feel very vulnerable every time you go to sleep in the game. But somehow Mundaun also displays the incredible ability to put things like a sleigh ride race down a mountainside against the little girl in the game, or a picture of Kurden and his grandfather to bring the game down to earth and make you feel like you're part of the family, making it all seem more personal. It feels very small scale, with only a handful of characters and no one outside the village knowing the full extent of what's going on. Mundaun creates a unique atmosphere full of wonder and enchantment, but also fear and unnatural dread. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. There's jump scares, but they don't feel very cheap and only crop up once or twice the entire game. They're very effective and caught me by surprise every single time they came up. Most of the enemies are eerie in design. The early Strawman enemies comes across as weird but not very threatening when you first see them. But it's more about what they do than what they are. On top of making horrific howls, they also seem to have this power that causes straw to grow on Kurden's body, which I personally found incredibly unsettling and revulsed immediately. It may be one of the most effectively creepy ways an enemy can attack the player in any game I've played to date. The downfall of being made of straw is they burn easily, and whilst they only seem to be a person in a straw outfit, when you set them on fire they still walk around slowly and follow you with pained screams until they fall over and burn, which is also pretty unsettling. The beekeepers float in the air eerily, and the creature that stalks the mountain causes an avalanche when it catches up with you. You can hear its heavy footsteps and jangling chains from across the hillside, letting you know it's never too far away. The main antagonist makes his appearance multiple times and takes on weird forms and performs a lot of strange and terrifying displays of power, but also he seems to abide to the rule of contracts, coming across as more of a demonic businessman than a traditional interpretation of Satan, which the game implies him to be like. The biggest problem is that whilst the implied threat was always very high, the actual threat never quite matched up to that. None of the enemies can follow you into the various safe houses, and you get a pitchfork and rifle to defend yourself, even if they don't work against some of the enemies. I never ended up dying from any of the monsters in the game. Whilst it's easy to say it failed in its mission, it holds up that perceived threat very well. Even if it's not actually threatening, it still puts the fear of death into the player. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The game opens with a slow bus ride accompanied with a menacing horn soundtrack reminiscent of The Shining, and uses the frantic violin plucking from that film too. There's a lot of great disturbing music with discordant, seemingly metallic cellos plucking their strings, grinding instruments, and what sounds like a violin bow being dragged across a harp. It's very strange and features instruments played in reverse and eerie scraping noises. It's haunting, dark ambient, reverb-soaked bells and timpanis, really excellently made to sound unhinged and somehow ancient and unsettling. It has its beautiful moments like the sleigh ride and the exit from the tunnels with some really gorgeous gushing strings. There's also several radio stations in the game you can discover as you play through it, and whilst a lot of them are people speaking in Swedish, I found the church radio station was by far the most unsettling for some reason. But for a large portion of the game it leaves you alone with the realistic outdoor ambience, the wind blowing in the trees, the sound of Curtin's footsteps, and this is where the sound effects really shine. There's been a lot of care into making the outdoor environments sound good, and the indoor reverb is pretty much perfect. There are several paintings in the game you can look at, and as the camera zooms in, you're immediately transported into the scene with a perfect recreation of what's happening in the picture just through sound. The game is saved by accessing grandfather clocks, and every time you save it plays an ominous orchestral swell as if what you've done cannot be undone, which I really like. The voice acting on Curtin's part always feels like he's very relaxed and only occasionally raises his voice for everything, even when faced with the supernatural. The other few voiced characters sounded appropriate, with Jeremiah sounding like a frail man and Walter being big and brash, suiting their characters perfectly. Not speaking Swedish, I'm at somewhat of a disadvantage, but to my ears, it all sounds really good. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. Whilst blood would have been hard to identify with the hand-drawn art style, the game had its fair share of bodies which were all creepily rendered like organic decaying charcoal or meat that had been cooked for too long. It's an interesting look, but it's not traditionally gory. But it doesn't feel the game would have benefited from having more realistic depictions of gore though, and I think it would have detracted from the uniqueness of the art style. So, by default, that's 4 Harry Masons.
Passa bene, mia giovane. Posso seguirti non? Aitra, ande specifiche ciot.
Ce este zvus?
Già, mia te non.
Story. The story begins with Curtin reading a letter of his grandfather's tragic demise in a barn fire. He comments that there's something wrong with the way the letter is conveyed and comes to Mundaun personally to investigate. Upon arriving, he finds a mysterious painting that sucks him back to the night of the barn fire. However, in place of his grandfather, he finds an old man trapped in the fire who grabs his arm, bestowing a curse upon him. The story is very loose and mainly involves following objectives given by Jeremiah, Walter, or Curtin himself, and slips back and forth between prophetic hallucinations and reality, travelling back to his grandfather's time in the war, where he had the original encounter with the old man. I find the Swedish folklore backdrop and the old man character and his mysterious ways really interesting, but the game doesn't really provide a lot of explanations. There's a few diary entries, and most of the ones I discovered were very brief and not very interesting. Some of the more supernatural events almost seem to come out of nowhere, and it becomes hard to tell what was a nightmarish dream and what was actually real. There's a lot of fade-out cuts to things, and sometimes it's unclear how you got to where you are, like parts of the games are a bit disjointed. It also feels some of the more major plot points were tied up in a strangely convenient way, as though they weren't properly thought through. There were some decisions to make near the end of the game which led to multiple endings, which I'm curious to explore further in the future, as the one I got was fairly negative. The open-ended gameplay allows you to solve a lot of problems in whatever order you want, but it kind of messes up the pace of the story too. Ultimately, Mundaun is really interesting, but it has a lot of flaws, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Mundaun is a really interesting gem, from its odd RPG elements to its open-ended exploration and side missions. It delivers a really unique experience. It's the only folk horror game I've ever thoroughly enjoyed, despite its flaws. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I found the straw men deeply unsettling, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.